You ever hear a story so strange you have to stop and ask, wait, how is that even possible? Well, let me tell you about a man named Cornealious Michael Anderson III. Folks around his way called him Mike. His story is one of those that'll make you question everything you think you know about justice and mistakes. Now, I'm going to take you from the very beginning, because with Mike, the ending doesn't make sense unless you understand how it all started. Mike was born in the mid-70s, right there in St. Louis County, Missouri. He grew up like a lot of boys in that part of the world. Tight-knit family, church on Sundays, neighbors who knew each other by name. His mom was a hard-working woman, the kind who didn't take shortcuts when it came to raising her boy. And Mike, he was one of those kids who had big dreams. Though he didn't always take the straightest path to get there. Life wasn't fancy. It was basketball at the park, music on the radio, and the hum of cicadas in the summer heat. And like a lot of young men trying to find their way, Mike made some bad choices. But nothing could prepare him for the decision that would change the rest of his life. It was August of 1999. Mike was 22 years old. There was a Burger King in St. Charles, Missouri, and late one night, the assistant manager was headed to the bank with the day's deposit. That's when Mike, along with another man, decided to rob him. They didn't use a real gun, it was a BB gun. But when you're on the wrong end of it, fear doesn't really care if it's loaded or not. They got about $2,000, ran off, and for a moment, it must have felt like they'd gotten away with it. But Charles police weren't slow. A witness got the license plate, and soon they were knocking on the door of an apartment where Mike was staying. Inside, they found no gun, but they did find a brochure for Beretta pistols. The prosecutor spun that into a picture of a dangerous man with a weapon. By March of 2000, Mike was standing in a courtroom, facing charges for armed robbery. The jury heard the case, saw the brochure, and they weren't interested in whether the weapon was real or not. They convicted him. The judge sentenced him to 13 years in prison. Now here's where it gets strange. Mike wasn't taken into custody that day. Instead, he was told he'd be contacted with instructions on when to report to prison. So he waited and waited and waited some more. Months passed, then years. Mike's lawyer had filed an appeal arguing that the pistol brochure shouldn't have been allowed into evidence because it had nothing to do with the robbery. In 2002, the Missouri Supreme Court denied that appeal. That should have triggered the Department of Corrections to come get him. Only they didn't. For reasons no one could explain at the time, the paperwork fell through the cracks. Somewhere in the system, his case got marked as if he was already in prison, which meant no one was looking for him. Now imagine being in Mike's shoes. You've been sentenced to 13 years, you've appealed and lost, and you're waiting for the knock at your door, but it never comes. You could run. You could leave the state. But Mike didn't do that. He stayed. He built a life. He took it as a sign from God that he was being given a second chance, and he was determined to live it right. He started working, paying taxes, and staying out of trouble. He married a woman named Lakana in 2007. They had kids. He coached his son's football team. He volunteered at his church, working in the video ministry. He even started a construction business, Anderson Construction, and Investment, and ran it openly under his real name. No fake IDs. No hiding in the shadows. Mike was living in plain sight, building houses by day and tucking his kids in at night. Over more than a decade, he became a husband, a father, a neighbor, a coach. His life looked like the American dream. And then, July 2013. It was a warm morning, sunlight pouring through blinds, the smell of breakfast in the air. Mike was making eggs for his little 3-year-old girl. That's when he saw something out the window, men in dark uniforms, moving fast. Before he could even process it, the SWAT team was at his door. AR-15s, shields. The whole street was blocked off. They weren't there for a search. They were there for him. Mike Anderson, you're under arrest. He tried to explain, this has to be a mistake. I've been here. I haven't run. I've built a business. I've raised my kids. But it didn't matter. Someone somewhere had finally noticed a clerical error that had let him live free for 13 years. And now they were there to collect. That's how, in an instant, The man who'd been free for over a decade found himself in handcuffs, his little girl crying in the background, his wife standing frozen in shock. They took him to the Southeast Correctional Center in Charleston, Missouri. The life he'd built, gone in a matter of minutes. And as those steel doors closed behind him, Mike was left with a single burning question. Would anyone care enough to fight for the man I'd become, or would they only see the man I used to be? They booked Mike into the Southeast Correctional Center like any other inmate. Fingerprints, mugshot, the whole process felt surreal. Imagine living in freedom for 13 years, coaching your kid's football team, paying taxes, running a business, and then suddenly, you're just an inmate in a jumpsuit. He is 36 now, not the same man who'd stood in court at 22. The man who entered those gates wasn't thinking about surviving prison. He was thinking about surviving the loss of his life. It didn't take long for word to spread inside. Other inmates would come up to him, curious. Hey man, I heard your story. That's crazy. You were out for 13 years. Even the guards were baffled. One officer actually said, I've never seen anything like this in my career. But here's the thing about prison. It doesn't care about your backstory. The rules are the same for everyone. On the outside, though, the story was starting to pick up steam. First it hit the local news, then the state papers, then CNN, CBS, and national talk shows were covering it. The headline was irresistible. Man sentenced to 13 years, never spent a day in prison until now. Reporters wanted to know everything. How did this happen? Why didn't he turn himself in? Should he still have to serve the time after living crime-free for more than a decade? Mike's family was stunned. His wife, LaCana, started speaking out, telling reporters how he'd lived these past 13 years, how he'd been a model citizen, a father, a business owner. The community? They rallied. Neighbors and church members, old clients. They all wrote letters to the governor and the courts. This man doesn't belong in prison. They said, we know him. We've seen the change. Inside, Mike kept it himself. He wasn't the guy causing trouble or trying to prove something. But every night, when the lights went out and the cell door clanged shut, he'd lie awake wondering, is this it? Are they really going to make me serve all 13 years now? The legal fight began almost immediately. His lawyers argued that his years of freedom should count as time served. The state pushed back, saying that no, time outside prison doesn't count toward a sentence unless you're under supervision. But the more the case was covered, the harder it became for officials to ignore the bigger question. What's the point of sending a man to prison when he's already proven he can live a law-abiding life? Even some victims from the robbery, people who'd been terrified that night back in 1999, came forward and said they didn't think Mike should serve the time. They saw the man he'd become, and they believed in redemption. Still, the justice system doesn't turn quickly. Days turn into weeks, weeks into months. Mike was missing birthdays, holidays, all the little moments he'd promised his kids he'd never miss again. Then came the moment everything shifted. In May 2014, after serving less than a year of that 13-year sentence, a Missouri judge finally ruled Mike Anderson would be released immediately. The courtroom erupted. Family members cried. Mike stood there, hands shaking, as the judge explained that keeping him in prison would serve no purpose. The man had changed. The proof was in his life. Walking out of that prison gate wasn't just freedom. It was like waking up from a nightmare you thought might never end. Reporters were waiting. Cameras flashed. Mike just smiled, hugged his wife, and told the world, your past doesn't have to define your future. You'd think that's where the story ends, right? But there's one more twist, and it's the part most people don't know. Because freedom wasn't the end of Mike Anderson's fight. It was the beginning of something even bigger and riskier. When Mike stepped out of Southeast Correctional Center in May 2014, he wasn't just walking into freedom. He was walking into a spotlight. News crews followed him home. Neighbors stood outside waving. It felt like the whole world was saying, we're glad you're back. But freedom after prison, even for a man who'd been out for over a decade before, comes with its own set of challenges. The first few weeks were a blur. He went back to his wife, to his children, to the smell of home cooking and the sound of laughter in the living room. His little girl, the one who'd been in the kitchen that morning the SWAT team came, wouldn't let go of him. She'd wrap her arms around his leg just to make sure he didn't disappear again. And Mike, he was drinking it all in, the feel of his own bed, the sound of birds outside the window. Simple things you don't realize you miss until steel bars are in the way. But here's the thing nobody tells you. When you've been part of a story that big, you can't just go back to being anonymous. People recognize him in the grocery store, at the gas station, in restaurants. They'd say, "Hey, you're that guy from the news, the one who didn't go to prison for 13 years. Most meant well. Some wanted to shake his hand. But others, they had opinions. Harsh ones. You got off easy. If it was me, I'd still be in there. It was a reminder that no matter how far you've come, your past still has a way of introducing you before you can speak. Mike decided not to waste a second chance. He reopened his construction business, went back to coaching, got more involved in his church. But he also started speaking to young people in schools and community programs, telling them about choices, consequences, and the possibility of redemption. And he didn't sugarcoat it. He'd tell them straight. I made a bad choice, and I could have spent my best years in cell. But for some reason, I was given time to change before they came for me. You might not get that time. So don't waste the life you have now. Media outlets kept checking in on him. CNN did follow-ups. CBS brought him back for interviews. Each time, he shared the same core message, that a man's life should be judged by who he is now, not only by who he was in his worst moment. But living that truth wasn't always easy. There were business deals that fell through because of his record. There were doors that stayed shut. And there was always a quiet fear in the back of his mind that some other forgotten piece of paperwork could bring the nightmare back. The years rolled on. His kids grew. He kept working. He kept talking to anyone who would listen about second chances. By the 2020s, the media had mostly moved on to other stories. But in his community, Mike's name still carried weight. People knew the man who'd been the center of that unbelievable legal error, and who'd used his freedom to try to build something better. The last big update to his case is simple but powerful. Mike Anderson never went back to prison. He's still free, still married, still a father, still a businessman, still living proof that sometimes the system makes a mistake, and sometimes, just sometimes, that mistake becomes the best chance a person will ever get to rewrite their story. And if you ask him today how he feels about it all, he won't tell you he's lucky. He'll tell you he was blessed. Blessed to have the time to change before the consequences came knocking. Blessed to have a community that stood behind him. Blessed to walk out of prison a better man than the one who'd been sentenced all those years ago. Because in the end, Mike Anderson's story isn't just about a man who avoided 13 years behind bars. It's about a man who learned what freedom really means and what it takes to keep it. And that is the full story. From the streets of St. Louis County to the courtroom, from freedom to a cell and back again. Proof that life can turn on the smallest details, and that who you become in the meantime might just be the thing that saves you. If this story gripped you, subscribe, share, and leave your thoughts below. Join us again here at the Mysterious Crime Box for more mysteries await inside the crime box.